All right, so I've kind of developed some of these ideas up until the stage of, kind of trying to provide a framework, to get to this question about the gospel stories and how do we approach what Jesus was about in terms of the context of the times and in terms of resolving portions of the story properly. And then also like the practicalities on the world stage with our lives and existence and like what's the expectation. And so now it's kind of gotten to the point where like reviewing the book of John, right? Some people will say it's the book of John that also seems to make reference to these claims where it places in question like what role was Jesus? Was he God? What does it mean to say the Son of God? And, so I'm just kind of starting in on some of these topics of review. And so it's interesting, I guess, to try to introduce a little bit of the context as I'm approaching this is, so what seems to be interesting in some of the conversations is this question that, people will say. So a lot of times when people are trying to interpret the Gospels, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the introductions to the story of Jesus's life as pertaining to this movement that's called Christianity or the way of Jesus or some sort of spiritual reference to Jesus, there's a lot of commentary as to like how to interpret those stories. Do they enter into like what frame of reference, what point of emphasis is used to interpret some of the different perspectives? And so what I kind of found interesting in these later years approaching the text for myself is this question that really trying to envision the experience of the disciples in this movement interpreting a lot of things through the power, the dominant world power at the time. And so in some ways, you could even imagine that they're also writing it, because eventually it shifts from there's the Jewish audience and their expectation and negotiations going on along those lines. And then there's it shifts beyond just the Jewish community, and it's the shared community within various provinces under Rome and whatnot. And it's likely as well, when you're thinking about that there's a historical connotation as well, though, to those that have a history within the whole region that also are influenced by some variation of like Judaism or the interpretations or this whole type of shared theory exchanges that go on. It's likely that they're introduced to a lot of these different versions of like similar theory trades incorporating various temples and gods and whatnot. And so you find a lot of similarities in the language use and accounting for various interpretations. And so even in that mindset, even if it does say the message goes to the Gentiles within Rome, they could all, what I'm suggesting is they could very well be familiar with these similar exchanges of ideas, similar to, say, like now on the world stage, people, even if they're not, say, like a Christian or Muslim or Jewish or some other variation, some other religious practice, they're very much aware of these components and these trait of ideas and the different factions to some degree. So I was thinking some of the so even at the time, like when you read through some general overview of like the time of the Maccabees. Like prior to this, there was even times where they were saying Jewish groups that were historically Jewish groups were starting to be seen as among the Syrians or different ones, because they didn't practice in other factions of Judaism. And so there were these like arbitrary dividing lines between different ones. And so even if some groups would say, well, now they're like, those groups are Gentile, maybe historically they weren't. And so that's kind of what I'm alluding to, as well as like when the movement goes outside of the Jerusalem and the like Judea Samaria area, and it starts expanding outward, it doesn't necessarily mean that other groups didn't have some sense of like a historical reference to these ideas. But what's also interesting is to kind of imagine at the time, it was very likely that they also absorbed the references and certain belief systems within Rome at the time, that Rome was kind of like perpetuating to some degree. What's also interesting is some of the likenesses are similar to some of the expectation as to like in the ancient Hebrew text in Daniel and in the Old Testament, when they're making references to world kings and dominions, as I had talked about before, there's these certain types of like societal components that they seem to be trying to solve for. And so they make reference to like kingdoms and dominions and their sons, and the taxes and the various forms of hierarchy and stuff like that. So along those lines, that's where you also get that language of like the Son of Man and stuff like that. There's just a lot of symbolism within these various components. So anyway, that some of that is what's in my mind as I'm trying to read through so I'm approaching the book of John, because that's one where people, like I was saying, it gets to this discussion on how do we approach the message of Jesus, and there's certain results on the other side of how you interpret that. So in certain ways that people approach an idea, is what's involved in certain ideas and interpretations can be a whole mapping of internal results from how you believe something. And so it is pretty significant in how you interpret something. For instance, as an example, like in the book of Hebrews, it says something, I believe it's in Hebrews, it says something to the effect of like the Levitical code was basically like in some sense already within Abraham, even though Abraham didn't practice it. And actually turn to that passage. It's in Hebrews 7, just because now trying to chip away at the New Testament and what it seemed like, trying to get into the framing and the expectation through like this stage of addressing the story. So Hebrews chapter 7, and he's kind of talking about leading up to through the patriarchs and whatnot. And he says this is 7:9, one might even say that Levi, who collects the 10th, paid the 10th through Abraham, because when Melchizedek met Abram, Levi was still in the body of his ancestor. But anyway, what I'm getting to is this idea that within certain ideas is basically kind of like a gateway to other ideas. And so even if like people will say, like you can even think of that in the political domain, political theory, there's certain aspects of like certain ideas might just on the surface be okay. This isn't to cause hysteria about negotiating basic ideas, but the idea that it can set into motion certain effects. So internalized within certain movements and ideas and interpretations can reframe or influence the way a whole lot of other interpretations after the fact are influenced. So at some level, that's why you can almost even say the way some of these portions, these pivotal portions, are interpreted can have a whole different kingdom framework internalized within those certain points. And so even like we're seeing now, people will say, how can some of these certain ideas have such ramifications on the world stage? And to some degree, it's because they create ways by which a lot of the other effects seem to be acceptable or unacceptable. And so it's important to look at that. Anyway, so here we are, and starting to chip away through the book of John. What's also, so I'm trying to think of, like, I'm trying to articulate and share a little bit of what I'm processing in my mind a little, like, as I'm reading through it. So what I'm looking for as I'm reading through now is I'm looking at more of a specific framework for, first of all, like, what's his audience? Because when you look at the other gospels, my, like, intro to them says stuff like, this one is written in reference to, say, like, the Gentiles in the area. This one is of influence to, like, the Jewish group and whatnot. And so you can imagine when you're reading it, they're going to introduce the story with reference points that are familiar and expectant to those different groups. And in reference to that, let me just kind of read some of the, like, introduction that I have in this version of the Bible that I'm referencing. So it says the author is John the Apostle. It's written between AD 85 and 96. And the time span is about 3.5 years, AD 29 through 33, in reference, that it's in reference to. And the title is from the author, John. So this is the book of John, or background. Although the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke have different viewpoints, they are quite similar in content and therefore are called the Synoptic Gospels. John is called the supplemental gospel because it stands uniquely in a class by itself. The book of John is different in many ways: style, structure, use of personal interviews, lack of parables, and spiritual explanations of events. John and his brother James follow John the Baptist until Jesus calls them to follow him. Jesus refers to these two as sons of thunder, but later John is referred to as the disciple whom Jesus loved. John, along with Peter and James, becomes especially close to Jesus. They alone are with Jesus at the Transfiguration and at Gethsemane. John wrote this book for the specific purpose that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. John also wrote 1, 2, and 3, or 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the book of Revelation. And this, where this is written, is at Ephesus. And it's written, it says, to whom? To the Gentiles and all Christians. The content, while Luke presents Jesus as the Son of Man, John presents Jesus in his deity as the Son of God. The Son of God. Jesus' relationship to the Father is emphasized as he teaches, heals, prays, and ministers. Miracles listed in John include turning water to wine, feeding the 5,000, walking on water, and the raising of Lazarus. But in addition to being totally God, Jesus's humanity is shown by his being tired, hungry, thirsty, sorrowful. 7 times Jesus refers to himself in I am passages, which clearly show his claim to godhood and the way to salvation. After Jesus' death and resurrection, great details given to appearances of the Lord before his ascension. And then it talks about keywords to kind of look for and themes, and then the outline. So this introduction, though, it does help to kind of give somewhat of a summary as to how this book is generally interpreted. And so this is what I'm going to examine and be looking at is, does it really say, because in the developing conversations that people are having now is they're looking at actually what did Jesus really say. And as we learn more of the context even though we can glean some good things from the effects of various like following and believing in and adhering to certain portions of what Jesus is providing an example for, even though there's some good things and there's been some good from that, are there ways in which now on the world stage and with people having more and more in-depth approaches to the text, are there other ways we could maybe interpret stuff and glean and refine it even more? And so among those questions, and as we're talking about negotiating between certain Jewish, Muslim, other historical contributors and other factions of Christianity, and just, the trading of ideas in general, can we take an honest look at these questions about how it affects the world and how we imagine the attributes of God by how we've interpreted or looked at Jesus? So that's what I'm thinking about. Another influence, so basically I'm going to be looking at, does he really claim to be a deity in the way that is supposed? Or is there a different language going on there? Does it mean something else? What I'm also considering as I'm reading the book of John is like, I'm not an expert in all of the history of looking at the worlds that they lived in. I have a general idea because I've been exposed to the study of scripture in various perspectives for like most of my life. And so I have a general idea as to what people reference or say along with the accompanied teachings in the context of the time. But as I feel like I'm reaching a different stage in my approach to where I'm just more accepting of other contributions and not always looking at the context as like in binary terms, or I'm just open to refining the way that I look at it and trying to look at it from a variety of different angles. And so along those lines as well, I'm approaching it, and I've read I've read these books before. I've heard them taught in so many different ways, but I'm challenging myself to just kind of look at it just almost like with fresh eyes, but at the same time with this new stage of my own personal development. And so revisiting it, I'm going to be probably reading it a lot differently, or understanding it or focusing on it a lot differently than I had in the past to some degree. So even though I'm very familiar with this book, like the scriptures and whatnot, I feel like I'm looking at it with like a fresh approach, I guess you could say. Along those lines, I think what I'm also considering as I'm reading John right now in this stage of my life is interesting that in the other books of John, so John, this is like the gospel where he gives like the overview of this story and his proposal to others on how to put these pieces together for the influence and testimony of Jesus and the story and the life. But what also seems interesting and what I'm considering or kind of trying on is, so in this introduction, in the other introduction to his other books, they're really short letters, John 1, 2, and 3. The introduction sets the stage for things that they're, in a theory-oriented way, challenged by in the context of the times. So it does seem to paint a picture of a barrier that he's trying to speak through and negotiate through. And if you imagine, for me, I'm going to be imagining that tension from these other theory proposals that he's trying to make reference to, so would probably influence the way he's using his words. So what I mean by that is, in the introduction to First John, his later letters, and it basically says the time frame is supposed to be around that same time. And so between 80, 85, and 96 by John the Apostle. And the background in the context for this one is, it says, in addition to the 3 letters bearing his name, John is also the author of the 4th gospel. That's the gospel I'll be reading over, or like studying through, and the book of Revelation. This letter of John is written to Christian congregations founded in truth and faith, but receiving serious challenges from false teachers. The particular error being propagated is a philosophy of religion called Gnosticism. It is built on the premise that all matter is totally evil, spirit is totally good, and that man will progress spiritually as he increases in his knowledge. This leads to further false teachings about Christ, stating that he could not have been born in the flesh since all flesh is evil. The Gnostic theories are that Jesus Christ is either a ghost that only seems to have a human body, or that he has a dual personality, sometimes divine and sometimes human. John's mission here is to combat these errors. So this is kind of what I was talking about in terms of how on the surface some ideas can seem like just a simple standalone idea, but it has like profound ramifications in practice. And so this is what this seems to be referencing, is that different groups are trying to make sense kind of in the public square of these ideas and what Jesus seems to be suggesting, because it's created quite a movement. And so there's some approaches to how Jesus, some of his claims were kind of vague and required a lot of interpretive understanding. And so people are starting to interpret things in such a way that John is perceiving as having profound issue in how they're interpreting the whole rest of the story. And so this certain form of Gnosticism is claiming that they're teaching, among other things, that like it was saying, the flesh is evil and God can only be purely spirit. And they don't know how to connect this to the physicalities and the other claims of Jesus. So for me, I'm going to be imagining him trying to speak through this pervasive idea that's growing around the ideas that are spreading about what Jesus represented, and in practice what you can or cannot do. And so there's this type of this split religiosity occurring, where certain groups are saying they're attributing various things to Jesus that it seems to be that John's trying to correct and say, no, there isn't this certain split between there isn't like a forever split between the material and the spiritual, even though God is a sense of God is spirit. And so you're probably going to start seeing him trying to weave those together, so that there isn't this improper reemergence of a religious dogma that is ultimately more harmful than useful as to the testimony of Jesus. A really quick summary, though, going into 1 John, not the Gospel of John, but 1 John, when he's making reference to that, he does kind of start trying to introduce trying to help equip people with how to approach this. And so he is trying to make a distinction between, because they're obviously, within, some religious movements, there's probably reasoning for them taking that approach, because they're seeing all of this excessive fleshly activity, and they're feeling they're probably, maybe there's some good intent in how they're interpreting that, because Jesus had said stuff like, I'm in the world, but I'm not of it. And so they're making this separation between the material world and the spiritual world, and they're kind of over spiritualizing it to the point where eventually that could be that could inhibit actual transformation on the world stage, because they don't feel confident to approach quote unquote worldly things. And so you see that's where John's kind of entering into it and kind of explaining how that's woven together and different than just simply isolating from the world in general. And so there's themes that he addresses, like Christians should not love, this is the title, this is not what he said, but this is the title of this passage. It says Christians should not love the world. But then what he also says is do not love the world or anything of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the cravings, the cravings of sinful man and whatnot, etc., etc. These things pass away, but the man who does the will of God lives forever. So he's trying to differentiate between the world, like when Jesus is making reference to the world, and then the work of living like a living being that lives from the center of the animation of spirit within, and then your outward expression is a testimony to that inward spirit. So he's trying to introduce those ideas probably at a time as well, like we're also in this day and age trying to do that type of discernment as well, and we start using language like systemic, like the systemic dominance or occupying systemic forces or things like that, where you try to give language so that people aren't just saying like everything is bad or the whole thing needs to be, broken down, but differentiating between certain misuse of the world and certain support for like an expression of life manifesting through transformative approach through the Spirit of God and stuff like that. So they're really trying to deliver that type of differentiation. So then there's this portion in 1 John 5. It says for everyone born of God overcomes the world. This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world? Only he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. And so he starts introducing these ideas, right? So then that even supposes this idea of how then does Jesus overcome these effects, this dominion of the world. Now I'm going to turn back to the Gospel of John. As I approach the Gospel of John, I'm not going to read through all of it as I just do this commentary. But I do want to read the chapter 1, because chapter 1 has a lot of these connotations of some type of spiritual authority or reference of Jesus. And I'm reading it, as I was saying, as though you're imagining that. So what I'm kind of looking at is, are there places where John is trying to weave together the way that God is working through Jesus, through material things and a redemptive sense of the material world, also with a type of spiritual authority as well. And he's doing that, as I was saying before, because of some of these other teachings going on around. Okay, so chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that had been made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. There came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testifies concerning him. He cries out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, He who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me. So just to clarify, he's referencing John the Baptist. So this is John telling the story of John the Baptist. So the Johns can get confusing here. He's introducing where Jesus came from in the context and all of these things. I'm thinking that the reason why he also introduces some of this, like the merging of the word and the flesh and the light, and as I was saying, was because he's trying to merge these worlds of working through the material and like the light of God and whatnot. And so he introduces, because at the time people are going to know who John the Baptist is, and this approach John is wanting to connect that Jesus is a product out from the movement of John the Baptist. So he says, John testifies concerning him. He cries out saying, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me. From the fullness of his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, and who is at the Father's side, has made him known. Now, this was John's testimony when the Jews of Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. He did not fail to confess, but confessed freely, I am not the Christ. They asked him, then, who are you? Are you Elijah? He said, I am not. Are you the prophet? He answered, no. Finally, they said, who are you? Give us an answer to take back to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself? John replied in the words of Isaiah the prophet, I am the voice of one calling in the desert, make straight the way of the Lord. Now some Pharisees who had been sent questioned him, why then do you baptize if you are not the Christ, nor Elijah, nor the prophet? I baptize with water, John replied, but among you stands one you do not know. He is the one who comes after me, the thongs of whose sandals I am not worthy to untie. This all happened at Bethany on the other side of Jordan, where John was baptizing. The next day, John saw Jesus coming toward him and said, look, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. This is the one I meant when I said, a man who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me. I myself did not know him, but the reason I came baptizing with water was that he might be revealed to Israel. Then John gave this testimony, I saw the Spirit come down from heaven as a dove and remain on him. I would not have known him except that the one who sent me to baptize with water told me, the man on whom you see the Spirit come down and remain is he who will baptize with the Holy Spirit. I have seen and I testify that this is the Son of God. So at this point, it introduces that Jesus is a product out from the testimony and what was going on with John the Baptist. And John the Baptist was quite an influential movement among some groups at the time. And so it's introducing that when certain religious authorities and various ones of influence came and asked him, like, who do you claim to be? What is your movement claiming to be? And so then that's when John is basically saying, like, I'm not the Christ, but I'm making reference unto this person. And it had been spiritually revealed to me through the stages of what I practice, that there's something like distinct about Jesus. So it introduces that stage of things. This next section, it says Jesus calls his first disciples. The next day, John was there again with two of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, look, the Lamb of God. When the two disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, what do you want? And they said, Rabbi, which means teacher, where are you staying? Come, he replied, and you will see. So they went and they saw where he was staying and spent that day with him. It was about the 10th hour. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said, who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, we have found the Messiah, that is the Christ, and then he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, you are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas, which when translated is Peter. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." "Nazareth, can anything good come from there?" Nathanael asked. Come and see," said Philip. I'm reading over this really quick because this is just kind of it's apparent that they're doing a very quick overview of the introduction of the development of the movement, introducing the characters, and then they're going to get to like the breakdown of the stories and things that happened. So this is him calling the various disciples and various ones. And you're seeing that it's an introduction of the influence of John the Baptist, making reference to Jesus. And then it's like this movement that's collecting. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, "Here is a true Israelite in whom there is nothing false." "How do you know me?" Nathanael asked, and Jesus answered, "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." Then Nathanael declared, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." And Jesus said, "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree. You shall see greater things than that." He then added, "I tell you the truth. You shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." So this is a very quick introduction in chapter 1. But what you're kind of getting, what I'm gathering, is there's a story behind these stories. And so it's almost like this is functioning as a quick chronology so that people that already know other references can see how the stories piece together. So what you're gathering at this point is there's a story behind the story, that the movement of John the Baptist, there was stuff associated with it that people started to find influential into his movement and baptism movement. And that he's even giving authority to this other movement and saying, in my spiritual personal moments of revelation, these are the things that are testifying into making reference to Jesus. And then it talks about him also then giving a level reference point to Jesus, and then that gives way to this collection of the various disciples. What I also am imagining is these references that they're making probably have other stories, for instance, making reference of him sitting under the fig tree, and at the time there being some kind of association of that, symbolic meaning of him doing that, which caused Jesus to recognize him, and then caused him to speak into his experience, and then for him to recognize Jesus as having some type of influence. So it's like a brief overview story, but there's probably a lot of meaning behind these different references that they're making very quickly here to introduce Jesus and his disciples. So that's basically chapter 1. I'm imagining later I'm going to go back and look at some of what it says in the beginning in reference to kind of the spiritual aspect of it, as it introduces and says in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then, making reference to through him all things were made, without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. So I wanted to go back and kind of look at some of those intro portions there. Chapter 2 then, so at chapter 2 and through some of the next sections, it introduces the miracles and whatnot. And for me, there can be time spent on the miracles, but it introduces his first miracle when he's, it says when he's they're visiting this wedding, and he's with his mother, and then he turns water into wine. There's a lot of things people can suppose about that. But I'm also reading it through the lens of what it causes me to think about is reading it through the lens of they're going to start giving testimony to introduce how Jesus is intertwined in a redemption of the material things and not so much a separation of it. And so I also think that's why this part of the story is probably of significance, because he's introducing Jesus being involved in a lot of various practices and societal happenings, and not necessarily withdrawing from them. And so the fact that he turns water into wine and whatnot, portrays this sense of being integrated into societal practices, not necessarily departed from them, which that's why I was thinking is a part of that intention that John has in weaving together the different aspects of like redeeming the material gathering places and whatnot. There also seems to be some applications to it as well symbolically, but I won't really go into that right now because it's also introduced right next to later. So he has kind of this miracle among the groups that are celebrating this wedding. And then he goes in and it goes into the story where he critiques various ones like within the temple. Next portion though does introduce a sense of like why they're introducing this, because it talks about, it says, this gave testimony to them about the reference in 2:17. It says, zeal for your house will consume me. So it's kind of introducing why they started to see like, it's just documenting his stage of progression as he's like being integrated into a spiritual reference, and then a following, and then connection in the community, and then directing it within like the temple and whatnot. It also then is where it makes reference to the temple that he speaks of is his own body, and it introduces that notion. Chapter 3 then is the section that some people might be familiar with in references to being born again when people talk about that. So chapter 3 says like there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a member of the Jewish ruling council. He came to Jesus at night and said, Rabbi, we know you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the miraculous signs you are doing if it were not from him or with him. And so Jesus' reply, what I'm gathering to as I'm rereading this is all very much a very quick, oversimplified summary of things that if someone were reading these, it would require them to kind of look into what's the story behind the story. But so this is where in chapter 3, verse 3, in reply, Jesus declared, I tell you the truth, no one can see the kingdom of God unless he is born again. How can a man be born again? So they go into this conversation. And Jesus replies, I tell you the truth, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless he is born of water and spirit. So this portion reminds you as to why John is probably introducing it in such a way where he's introducing John the Baptist's like water like sect, and that Jesus comes out from that and is basically like born through the spirit. And then it says, flesh gives birth to flesh, but the spirit gives birth to the spirit. You should not be surprised at my saying you must be born again. And so it kind of goes into these conversations and whatnot. And then he kind of speaks some more and then says, like, I've spoken to you of earthly things that you do not believe. Then how will you believe if I speak of heavenly things? And so then he kind of goes into these references of a portion of like his calling coming from. So how I kind of summarize it as I'm reading it at this point is he's giving reference to the authority that he's been given from the heavenly dominion, the heavenly kingdom, and he's born through the spirit, through the heavenly dominion, and then that he brings that light in reference to the way he's emerging on the world stage. And it's different from those born through or like functioning through the world dominion. And so I think it's also like one of John's ways of, as I was saying, like introducing that integration. And so the integration that they're drawing from is this whole other different kingdom dominion that's a heavenly dominion born of the spirit that is like replenishing and reconnecting a different dominion unto the world, because the world had become encompassed in those things just merely born of the flesh. And so it seems like John's trying to give arguing point to these other sects and groups that are saying, how are you accounting for the issues that we ascribe to the flesh or the world, and then the heavens and the spirit of God? And so he's introducing these ideas of like being born again through this like recentering on the heavenly kingdom, and that he's basically kind of like the first fruits of this like restored dominion because of his spiritual call being born into this commitment unto God's kingdom. Introducing this stage, this is like the passage that a lot of people make reference to, John 3:16. So, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned. Whoever does not believe stands condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. So then this is where he kind of makes reference to what he introduced in chapter 1. This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but men love darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear of his deeds, that his deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by truth comes into the light, so that it may be seen plainly what he has done and that it has been done through God. So for me, this is where I'm kind of giving that visual of these different, like birthing into this renewal of this other system, this heavenly dominion that is touching ground into our material existence and integrating it and transforming it. And so that's what it seems to be saying, is that the world had come under this other dominion, and this is like a different heavenly dominion being introduced, and that those that can adhere to it would be integrated into it. This stage in chapter 3, we get to the point where at the end it kind of starts giving hints that this goes beyond just within the Jerusalem type teachings, because or within Judaism, because it says it starts to speak of like an all-encompassing type heavenly dominion. Because the one who comes from above is above all, and the one who is from the earth belongs to the earth and speaks as one from the earth. The one who comes from heaven is above all. And then it introduces some other ideas, but basically then you can start getting this connotation that this is a shift toward dominions and the heavens and the earth, what had become of the earth in relation to the world dominion, and a redemptive aspect, all-encompassing redemptive aspect, which is interesting because then in the next chapter, chapter 4, is going to be when Jesus meets with the Samaritan woman at the well. And so now that he's kind of set the stage for this seeming to be an all-encompassing reference of dominions and kingdoms from the heavenly realm to the redeeming the worldly, earthly realm, it then goes into this like historical division that is a product of the times and the context that they make reference to in terms of like Judaism within the region. Because then now that it introduces in chapter 4 Jesus speaking with the Samaritan woman, it gives connotation to that divide of Judea and Samaria, and how that is a stage of a certain interpretation of Judaism, which is in reference to a type of preservation, which is in reference to a historical preservation of a certain awaiting, pending interaction or context within Jerusalem, within Judea and Samaria, and within how they're interpreting Judaism. So it's interesting at this point we see the transition of this movement from John the Baptist concurring with this stage of Jesus, and then we see the spiritual development of Jesus drawing various disciples unto himself, and then we see Jesus integrated within the community events and celebrations and the wedding, and that his basically his call is not to separate from those things, but to be integrated into them in various relational ways. And then you see his approach to what he seems to deem a level of corruption within the temple, and then his claim to fulfill the quote from Isaiah, "Zeal for the house will consume me." And then he also makes reference to him pointing to his body being the temple. And it's like a very quick overview, right? And then we get to this point where he's confronting some of the historical gridlock in the area now in chapter 4 with the Judea and Samaria, when he goes and speaks with the woman from Samaria. And at this time, he's kind of taking that connotation or that role of one working through the path of the temple in Jerusalem, but also speaking into the connection with this Samaritan woman. And so then she brings up that historical tension. She basically kind of testifies to the point of, in her estimation, in terms of the historical gridlock, she refers to him or recognizes him as a Jew and her a Samaritan. Because she recognizes this sense of the divide, even if among his own. So it's kind of interesting because even if among his own community, there's question as to various ones, whether he seems like an authentic Jewish person or not, or what faction. And so there's like the internal conflict. But at least in the grand scheme of things, where people recognize the historical divides, she sees him as of the Jewish side and she's the Samaritan side. And so they have this conversation, and it's an interesting conversation in chapter 4. And she's kind of just saying, well, who's right, us, like this side or that side, that kind of thing. And so then he introduces that he basically kind of introduced, there's a variety of symbolic things going on there, just like with all these chapters leading up to this. There's more to kind of draw from the symbolism and the references, but in general he kind of says there is a truth that is going to come through, that comes through Jerusalem, that basically needs to be brought into like a completion. And once that is understood, then this disconnect between the historical divisions between the temple on Mount Gerizim of the Samaritans and the temple in Jerusalem, that God will shift beyond that. And so then the worshipers will worship God in spirit and truth, because God is spirit and his worshipers must worship in spirit. And they'll no longer need to address or go into these various like conflicting temples and whatnot in that same sense. And then he speaks with her in such a they have a certain type of connection, and he kind of speaks into her life a little bit, to the point where she concurs and she feels like it's a good message. And so then to her, she then says, like, I see that you're a prophet, and like you're like speaking, like you have some type of spiritual anointing. It's interesting because he doesn't correct her. Like, he doesn't say, no, I'm not a prophet, or no, like he just kind of leaves it at that. And it's interesting too, because in her estimation, maybe what he's saying really is at the stage of a prophetic word. Like, he's given a prophetic word to what seems to make sense of this like inescapable, perpetual historical conflict. And what's also interesting about it, that there does seem to be truth that there should ultimately be freedom outside of the temple, that people can meet God beyond it. But there also needs to be something resolved through the temple. And so it just seems to be that it concurs with her, where she's like, yeah, you know, in a sense, like that does actually speak into my question, because it can't really be, you know, there needs to be something prior to this like back and forth of the temples and the divide and whatnot. Now we kind of move into these various stages of the progression of his connection, and now he's like also reaching into resolving, supposing, right? That's what we're looking into, like supposing to resolve the historical tension, the stage of the representation of the temple, and some of these divides and whatnot.